and thank you, Vera, for agreeing to come back to the Vermont Studio Center, and thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight. It's my pleasure to introduce Vera Iliatova, and this is not Vera's first time here, but it is her first time here as a visiting artist. Vera was here as a resident in 1999, I think I looked it up, as a fellow sponsored by Yale, where she had just finished graduate school. So I'd just like to tell you a little bit about Vera before I turn it over to her, but of course she's going to be the one who is the expert in her own work. It was very fun for me to go online and read a little bit about what other people were saying about Vera's work, and in particular it struck me that Ken Johnson wrote in the New York Times that in her dreamy paintings of girls in verdant landscapes, Vera Iliatova toys with conventional associations of nature, femininity, childhood, and innocence. And I'm very excited to see this figurative work because there's so many different ways you can talk about it, and looking forward to what Vera has to offer us tonight. But just so you know a little bit of her background, Vera was born in Russia and came to the U.S. when she was 16, I believe, right? And she studied in Paris at the Sorbonne and then went on to Brandeis, and then went to Yale for her MFA in painting and printmaking, and she also attended the Skowhegan School of Art. She has had numerous solo, two-person and three-person exhibitions at the Monia Row Gallery in New York, in Barbara Walters Gallery at Sarah Lawrence College, at the David Castillo Gallery in Miami, in La Montagna Gallery in Boston, in Copenhagen, and also in Monte Castello in Italy. She has been in many, many group exhibitions and has numerous awards, including the Maria Walsh Sharp Studio Program, a faculty research grant from UC Davis, a Yale Fellowship for the Vermont Studio Center, Skowhegan Fellowship, and other traveling and awards from Brandeis University. She's been a visiting artist at many places, including the University of New Hampshire, Rhode Island School of Design, Tyler School of Art, Lehman College in New York, Mass College of Art, Maryland Institute, New York Figurative Academy, and Brandeis and Boston University. She has many, many group exhibitions to her name, but I think at this point I'd like to turn it over to Vera to talk to you about her own work. Would you please help me welcome Vera Iliatova?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Kathy, and thank you, everybody, for coming and having me here. It's so amazing to think that it's been like 16 years, and it's and I still remember some places. It was definitely like an amazing summer, and now, I don't know, I think there are probably some people here who might be students on a fellowship. I remember when I was a student here, I looked at people who were already out of school for many years, and some of them would come, I think at a time you could come for 1 week, maybe 2 weeks. And I remember thinking, like, 1 week, that's nothing, you just unpack for 1 week. And now that I've been out of school for such a long time, I'm like, oh my God, 1 week, like you have nothing but studio, and people, feed you that amazing food, including that salad dressing that I don't know, whatever. Anyway, we can talk about salad dressing at lunch. So thank you so much. It's really such a privilege to be back and to talk about my work. I wanted to show a few images of things that inspire me. I love art, I love painting, but my other great passion is film. It's kind of a particular, type of film, but I'm a little bit of a junkie when it comes to film, and I love, love, love reading about film as well. It's interesting, when I was in graduate school, I took art theory, we had to take art theory class, and it was a little bit disheartening to, go through all these readings on art in the 20th century, about death of painting, death of easel painting, death of the figurative painting, death of oil painting, and then going into your studio and actually trying to make a painting. But when I was taking film theory courses, I realized that, you can read like Susan Sontag's essay about death of cinema, and first of all, I was not a filmmaker, but secondly, not take it so literary, So film has been a great inspiration to me, and I just I brought just different clips. So this is Goodbye Dragon and by Tsai Ming Liang, and it's about a last 24 hours of this dilapidated movie theater. And in this film still there is an attendant on the left, and she's watching the projection of the movie. So it would be kind of like if I was standing here and there would be a film projected. And what I really loved about this, it takes place in a movie theater, which is this kind of enclosed environment where you have fiction projected larger than life on the screen, and then you have this observation of people's lives, the woman who works in the movie theater or the attendees, people who come frequently. So that kind of juxtaposition between the so-called reality and also the fiction in the film is very exciting to me. This is Way Down East by D.W. Griffith. It's an early 20th century film with Lillian Gish, an amazing silent film actress. And what I really love about silent film, first of all, how young the medium is. So this, I don't remember exactly the date of this film. I assume it's somewhere, in the maybe 20s when the film was made. So the film media was probably about 20 years old. And to me, this early film, I kind of compare it to early Renaissance painting, where artists just learned about perspective but didn't quite have those like perfect mathematical rules. So there was this kind of figuring out how to create a sense of space, how to make a plane feel grounded, and the awkwardness, but also this kind of tension of wanting to invent and wanting to make it real. And I think a lot of that happens in early film and silent film as well. There is a filmmaker, Paul Schrader, who in the past 4 or 5 issues of Film Comment has been writing about technology in early film and how the technology influenced content. So the idea of perspective and knowledge about perspective, or the idea of color, mixing color in oil paint, how that influenced the content of an early Renaissance paintings, for example. But also, what's important for me is this particular content in this film. I'm interested in the motif of a figure in the landscape, and primarily female figure in the landscape. And these are the last few moments of the film where the heroine is having an emotional breakdown, and she's running on icy bank of the river, and the piece of ice breaks off and floats down the river with her. But the way that the landscape becomes this kind of larger projection of the psychological state of the figure. And the other thing, in early film, the close-up was very difficult because of the kind of lenses that they had and the kind of lighting that they had available. So the figure had to be particularly expressive, and also there was no sound, so this kind of heightened drama, or maybe even melodrama, the importance of gesture, the importance of a contour of the figure against the space, that to me is also visually something that's very exciting. This is Stromboli by Bergman, and it's about the protagonist is a woman from Eastern Europe, and she finds herself on this volcanic island in southern Italy, and she's undergoing, as she's towards the end of the film, as she's undergoing the psychological transformation, she's actually walking through the volcano, through the explosion of the volcano. And what's great about Rossellini and Italian neorealist filmmakers is this love for the documentary, right? The way that the camera records the nature, in that particular film, the fisherman, the texture of life, and yet it's also set to be a fiction. And for me, I'm somebody who paints from observation, but does other things as well. That idea of painting becoming a documentary of what I see, but also a place for invention. For me, that's very exciting, and I think that's kind of present in the film. And then just, kind of formal things like her wearing that particular kind of dress that's very fragmented into this, light gray, dark gray, which matches the fragmentation in the landscape, rock, soot, and the way that she's disintegrating into the landscape around her is, something that, I'm just showing the images that, inspire me for various reasons. This is a film still from a Swedish film, Lilia Forever by Lucas Moodysson. And the film takes place in a post-Soviet Russia. So it's about this teenager, she's about, 15, 14 years old. And she's left behind by her mother. Her mother moves to the United States and she's left behind. I didn't see the last 10 minutes of the film because I basically was like crying by that point. So I don't quite recommend this for anybody to watch. It's a completely heartbreaking thing. But for me, I think I watched it before I went back to Russia. I left in 91, and this film came out in 2000. It came out in 2002, I believe. And, so I haven't been, I missed St. Petersburg. I haven't been to Russia in about 10 years. And to kind of see that representation of life, that, I remembered, but also the facades being taken and this kind of exposure of this trauma, that the country has from, the history of communism and so on. To me, that was kind of an amazing portraiture. But also in terms of the iconography, this kind of buildings on the outskirts of the city, in the city you have this historical, beautiful centers. The outskirts look very much like this kind of, geometric, almost like brutalist architecture, exposure of the ground, the grass, lack of this manicure landscape. To me, visually, that was really interesting. And this is another Eastern European film from Romanian filmmaker. It's called 4 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days. And what's interesting, it's about this, the film was made in the early 2000s, but it's talking about the Soviet times. So I think very late 80s, early 90s. And it's about this relationship, this friendship between these two women, and they're almost kind of like the magnets, the space between them is both like attracting them and also repulsing them. And, but this like very kind of specific space between two women, to me, that was pretty interesting. I think this is like an image from the poster, this kind of a iconic scene in the movie. And then in terms of painting, this is The Flood by Pusan. Pusan is somebody that I look at because of the way that he structures his landscape, this kind of almost like an artificial organization, the sense of artifice in his landscape, and the, stage-like use of color. And yet there's also something that's really believable in terms of the atmosphere, in terms of the color, in terms of the drama in the landscape. And this is one of the 4 paintings of the cycle, seasons. There's spring, fall, this is winter, and then there is autumn. But to organize a cycle of paintings based on seasons, based on the way that the light, the sun affects the landscape, for me, that was pretty exciting. And this is Alexandra Deineka, an amazing painter, one of the early social realist artists in Russia. What's interesting about social realist painting is before 1921, there is a lot of invention in those paintings, and there is a lot of excitement. So the revolution happened in oh God, I cannot believe I'm blanking on the date. Terrible. 17, yes, I'm sorry. How could I ever forget? So this is just a few years after the revolution, and there was a lot of, like there's a work by Malevich, there is, excitement about abstraction, and the figurative artists, the social realist artists, they're picking up on that excitement about the pictorial space, about flatness, about that kind of freedom that you can manipulate the size of the figure and not adhere to that idea of a window space, but also about the excitement about the figure, the human figure, the builders of the new state, and particularly the images of women. Women were encouraged to work. Women were a working force, and so there is all this portraits of women at work, women being equal with men, and in a strange way, now that I'm a mother, I realized that that was kind of like a great part. There were 99.9% of horrible things, but there was also this kind of encouragement of a woman to work, which I grew up with, like we never had, women were working, So, but the paintings themselves are really great. And then, of course, with Stalin, all of that got shut down, and then you got this very strange post-impressionist, paintings of the workers' symposium, like a kind of a very conventional style. But this earlier, right around 1920s paintings, and particularly this person who is not very known in the United States, are pretty exciting. And this is, of course, a painting by Cézanne, an early painting by Cézanne, and I love those kind of very strange early narrative paintings where he takes from different things. It could be like a fashion plate illustration, it could be quotation, of another painting, like those, people in the boat. It could be his observation of figures in the park, and also there's different parts of the landscape. The landscape becomes, trees, clouds. They're like this protagonist that he's moving around in the space of the canvas as if it was a stage. And the awkwardness, this kind of like not quite knowing how to figure it out, to me, all of that is very magical. This is a picture of St. Petersburg. I grew up in St. Petersburg. One of the things about St. Petersburg is in the spring, you have this thing called white nights. So the rest of the year, in the winter, you have this horrible winters where it gets light, the sun rises at 11 a.m. and it goes down at 2:30 p.m. and everybody's depressed, But there's a couple of weeks in the spring and early summer where it's basically, like the way that it is outside right now, it stays up the whole night like that. And nobody sleeps. It doesn't matter, like you could be 2 years old, you could be like 98 years old. Everybody is out. It's amazing. Like 2 weeks of no sleeping. But I think that particular kind of light, it's a very humid place. It's kind of like Venice. It's built on a swamp. It has a lot of stucco-colored architecture and this half light, something that I really love, this kind of tonality of all these different grays. And then in terms of St. Petersburg, like this is a construction site. The first time I went there was in 2003. St. Petersburg is built in 1703. It's a very young city, 300 years old. So if you compare to most of the cities in Europe, and even in the United States, this is a very young city. So they restored all of it for the tricentennial celebration, but they restored all the facades. If you go inside of the courtyards, they were still kind of like rotting inside, which in some ways, unfortunately, is kind of like the state of the affairs. No matter what kind of facade is being put up, there's always this kind of darkness and sadness that's underneath. And this is a view from my apartment where I was growing up. And nobody in my family has been an artist. I never studied art in Russia. My mother always took me to the museums, but I didn't even think that artist was a profession, or let alone there were artists that were alive. I thought they all kind of died, and there was no contemporary art. So I just assumed like Malevich was the last one, and then they all died. And I think that, I don't know, something happened. Like one day I woke up and I looked outside of the window and I took a piece of paper and painted this is not the painting, this is the picture. But, something that looked pretty much like that. And then my brother sent me this picture a few years ago and I was like, wait a second, this kind of space, this almost like isometric perspective where you're looking at everything at once, there is no focal point. That's the space that I have been exploring in my paintings. So that was very strange coincidence. This is not a family picture or anything, but this is an example of what we looked like as teenagers. We all wore uniforms and we had maybe one skirt on top of that, you did not have a wardrobe where you changed clothes. Yeah, we were cool on the inside, but but I think that's how we looked like for the outside world. And then when I went back in 2003, all of a sudden the same people started looking like this, and that was a shock to me, because another thing that happens in St. Petersburg during White Nights is that you have it's a little bit of like a coming of age city. You have people go, parents take their kids who graduate from high school on this trip, I'll take you to St. Petersburg, and then you have, this young, like here there's young women, these friends, and they go together to St. Petersburg and they take pictures of each other. And there's something so, they dress up a little bit, there's something so amazing about this kind of demonstration of friendship and also this kind of ritual, we're going to St. Petersburg, we're going to. So now I'm just going to talk a little bit about my work, and I have a timer here, so I will not go over time. I started working from, I always loved working from observation. This is from undergraduate. This is a painting from my studio, and it's a very poor photograph. I loved looking at light. Here it was like the window, the things outside of the window, and the transparent curtains that would catch the light. But I guess, I don't know, I never felt like it was, the paintings were awkward, and I just never felt like they were enough. So I started putting paintings on the walls. So there's kind of a dark painting that, it's hard to tell, but there's a painting on an easel that has figures. I was trying to bring the figure in, maybe not like physically bringing the figure in, but at least like some kind of narrative that was going on the walls or on the easel in other paintings. And then this is a series of very small paintings. They're like 8 by 10 or something like that. I came up with this idea that I can start dressing myself. The problem every figurative painter has is like, I want to paint a figure, and I like looking at somebody, where do I get models? Or sometimes you get this type of models that don't quite fit with the narrative of your painting. So I started dressing up, and that was so much fun. I remember I was like, oh, I got a blue wig. Or I would get things from a thrift store, and I would I would walk home from the studio and I see somebody carrying grocery bag, and I was like, oh, that's cool. Like I can make a painting of myself carrying grocery bag. I didn't really think of them as self-portraits. I thought of them more like persona. And what was great about painting myself is that I could I could probably be kind of like a blank, It was not a painting about me, but it was a painting about the persona that I was creating. So, and then another question is that I had for myself at that time is that the paintings were pretty small, 8 by 10, and I wanted to work on something a little bit larger. So I came up with this idea of making a painting that it's pretty much life size, so I don't know how many, like 15, 20 inches high and maybe 8 feet long. And that's when I was really looking at film, and I was thinking about this kind of circular narrative. I was looking at like Greek vases. I was also looking at Villa of the Mysteries, that kind of narrative that would not necessarily have a beginning or the end. So on the left, there's a figure looking in the mirror, and on the right is the reflection of her in the mirror. So you can, go from right to left. You get to the left, you can go back to the right again. So that's kind of a very, very blown up detail. The figure itself is probably 15 inches. So that to me was a little bit of a breakthrough. And then I, graduated from graduate school and got my first teaching job accidentally in New Hampshire, and pretty much kind of felt like that after graduate school. I always loved New York, and I always wanted, I considered myself, well, I am a city person. I had no idea what to do with the landscape. I remember I was calling up my friend and I was like, what do I do? And she said, well, you live in the coastal New Hampshire, go walk on the beach. And I'm like, but there's nobody there. Maybe there's a serial killer. Like I was so afraid, like I didn't understand how to deal with the landscape. And also I think that's like a time of great uncertainty. You got your MFA, everybody has been paying attention to you for a couple of years. And then all of a sudden, goodbye, and like, what do you do next? So I was teaching and trying to figure out my work. And one summer I got to teach in Italy, and I had a studio that was on top of the hill, and I was looking down at the landscape. I had that aerial viewpoint, and then I was also looking at a lot of Sienese painting at the time, and I thought, oh, this is amazing, isometric perspective. I can create a large painting, and I don't have to enlarge the figures. So when I came back, I started making these paintings, which were 40 by 50 inches. And the reason why I didn't want to have a large figure is whenever you have a large figure, that's the figure that picks up all the attention, that becomes the protagonist. And I didn't want to have a main protagonist in the painting. I mean, I was looking at like Iranian miniatures and, early Renaissance paintings. But what was exciting to me is when I was putting those narratives together, I never knew like what the story was. So I would just start with the idea of light. I wanted a particular kind of light in the painting, and I would start with one figure, and then I would put another one next to her, and they would like react to each other in my mind. And then there would be the third one, and there would be a relationship with her, and then the fourth and fifth. And it was basically like telling stories to myself. I've always been, I love to read. I think I've been much more kind of like a literary person than I don't know. So that to me was just very, very exciting. And then I could, play with the idea of, daytime, nighttime, the idea of seasons. This one is called doldrums, and that's like what it's like in New Hampshire in the winter. And this is spring. I mean, this was kind of like a crazy time. I was in my late 20s, and I don't know. I mean, people can relate to that. I just didn't know what was going to happen. And then I just kept moving around the country. I moved to California, and every time I would move, a different landscape would present itself to me. And all of a sudden, it became, the landscape being this foreign thing, all of a sudden became this amazing narrative element that I could use. So I think this one is called Western. I was looking at like some of the, I lived in Central Valley by Sacramento, so some of that architecture that you see in California. This is a detail. This was kind of a grand painting for me. I think every 2 years, now I'm starting to work much larger. Mostly the paintings are 40 by 50 inches. But now I'm starting to work a little bit larger. But every 2 years, I would make this large painting. And then in terms of the process, again, like they start very abstractly, and I usually try to trick myself in starting them with the colors that I would never normally use, So, whatever I have in the studio, I just start putting washes of paint. And this painting, I think, started as a vertical painting of one single large figure, and I just kind of keep rotating. And some of that kind of history of mistakes, or revisions, I like to keep, it doesn't show up on these images, but I'm very interested in kind of a painterly mark, the way that the paint, the scrape, the, wash, more opaque paint. To me, all of that becomes part of the narrative. So there's some of the details. Oh, another thing is also I wanted to organize this painting in terms of time of the day. So there is like a moon, a sun, and the moon again in the sky. So I was thinking about it early morning, midday, and then early evening. And on the right, there is in the lower right corner, there is a little movie theater that used to be all over California, like in the small towns, there's tiny little boxes of movie theaters. And there's two figures that are kind of leaving in this. They have a gesture the gesture is from Masaccio painting, Expulsion from Paradise. And the time, I had this academic jobs. I was always like the youngest one in the department. I was single, and they were always in like the smaller towns. So I just spent a lot of time either making work in the studio or watching films. In fact, it was just like, I just went through everything. At that time they had videos, so I just went through like everything that they had in the video stores and watched all of it. So in some ways, like their expulsion from the paradise is their expulsion from the movie theater. And that's, their, the reality of those figures. And then the gestures, some of the landscape, like this landscape is taken from an Antonioni film. If you've been to Rome, those kind of pines that they have are from Rome. So there's kind of a composite nature of. And then I went back to Russia, I think, for the first time. And I think in some ways that's a painting, it was on the west coast. There was an eruption of Mount Helen that was written about at the time. And then the landscape on the bottom is appropriated from that film Lilia Forever. And so what I would do is I would find a gesture in a film that I really respond to, that me feels very meaningful, and then I kind of reenact that in the studio. You know, I have like a couple of mirrors, I have a whole wardrobe of different clothes, and then, but the gesture is not necessarily something that I invent. The gesture, it ties for me the painting to that other narrative that happens in the film. So that's another kind of a Moscow architecture with a California landscape. And this one, I was playing with the idea of like real light, artificial light. You know, there's a filming scene that's taking place, and then there's a real moon, and then there's also the moon of the spotlight, you know. So, another painting that is a composite of all the different buildings that I lived in California. And then in some ways, I guess, I don't know, a lot of times the work just changes when my studio changes. You know, here I had a studio in Mary Walsh Sharp, so I had a view of Manhattan and the bridge that was going over Manhattan. So that was enough for me to look out of my window and kind of take the specificity of color and light from what I see. The painting is also called Extras. So in the, right there, there's a group of men that are filming. It's like a crew, and there's like a filming equipment there. And this, I was thinking about these women, you know, that are just like waiting around, you know, while the main film is getting filmed. I think it's called, I think this one is called Lunatic Urbane, but again, it's this kind of similar motif. There are men that are filming this woman here, and then there is this kind of like unraveling that's happening in the time. And this is a little detail. I was also at the time reading this amazing book by T.J. Clark called The Sight of Death, and that's him talking about Pusan, and he was talking about different kind of trees that Pusan uses in his paintings. Some of them are like fans, some of them are like opaque screens, semi-opaque screens, and some of them are like feathers. So this painting was a little bit of an homage to the things I read in that book. Again, that motif of like a filming that takes place, and then, you know, another kind of drama that's getting recreated. And then, you know, this is when I moved to New York. You know, there's like Statue of Liberty, Manhattan. To me, you know, I moved from Russia to New York, and then I traveled all over the country, and then I moved back to New York. So there was a lot of them are kind of, I mean, they're not autobiographical, but they're about like idea of like departure and leaving behind and arriving, and the circular kind of movement. This is called Brooklyn Foxes. When I moved back to New York, I was working in the bedroom of my apartment, and I started missing that kind of grand landscape, you know, like the New Hampshire coastline, you know, or, you know, California desert and so on. But there were a couple of trees outside of the window, and the trees became this kind of protagonists, you know, the light through the trees, that kind of became the important aspect of the paintings. I was thinking about, you know, the architecture, where, you know, the idea of a school, you know, where do you see so many women that would be similar age kind of congregating against their will, you know, and something like, you know, schoolyard. I love this kind of coming of age school stories. You know, I'm kind of an expert on teenage television that takes place in high school. You know, certain young adult novels, you know, things that I'm finally not embarrassed to admit just because I love them so much. And then again, the painting, you know, this was started as a kind of an orange painting, and I think I put some tape on it. You know, I kind of try to remove myself from making a visual image for as long as possible, and then, you know, towards the end, it kind of locks into place. I was just talking to, I don't know, it's funny, like to me, all those, the places, the spaces, everything just felt so like believable in that painting, in those paintings when I was making them. You know, I really felt like it was a very kind of realistic space. And I was just talking to this amazing artist, Donna Nelson, and she said, you know, your paintings, they were like, you know, I mean, she was positive about the work, but she said, they were kind of like alarmingly funky. And I was trying to figure out what she meant. And she said it was, the displacement did not just take place with the figures, but it was also, there was really kind of no sense of space in there. And yet it had to be kind of very specific at the same time. And then at the same time, I work on some smaller works. This is probably like, I don't know, 9 by 14. So I don't have that kind of grand space to deal with. And that's when I can focus on like particularities of the relationships. They're usually less figures, there's usually like 2 or 3. And so it becomes not so much about wandering around the space of the painting, but more about like looking precisely at what's happening. This is called Central Park. I thought that Central Park, or City Park, that's another example where you can see some kind of drama between young women that in a place that's not completely quite wild. I think I had a studio that like was overlooking Staples and the parking lot. There were 3 trees, and then there were like some kind of god-awful buildings. So I would just like use those 3 trees, 9 different times to create a sense of woods. And then I would use the same building like 4, I was kind of thinking about this as like almost like a Morandi still life, where he would have like a couple of, particular kind of objects that he kept rearranging in different ways. This is called Gowanus Match. My studio right now is in this industrial part of Brooklyn, Gowanus canals, and the canals are actually quite pretty, but they're completely toxic. It's a Superfund site. So that kind of toxicity of color is something that I was interested in. And this is another large painting. I was, God, I'm going to go faster. I was working as an art director on a film that was filmed in Connecticut. So I was able to see a lot of shots taken in the middle of the night, and that excitement of a bright light, of filming at night in the landscape was something really amazing. And the way that the painting is structured is I was thinking like daytime, nighttime, good girls, bad girls, but then of course, there's no such thing as like, good girls. So, so these are some close-ups from that painting. And I think at every end of there's always, I think, as a student, you always, or as an artist, really, you're always trying to find your thing. Like, oh, what is my thing? And then you find your thing, and then like, oh my God, that's my thing. It's so boring, So how do you I didn't know what to do. So I started making this little ceramic portraits of my friends. And they're pretty small, like, this big. I was so excited. I was so happy making them. So my friends would pose for me, and I would sculpt from observation. I thought it was such a sculpting from observation. But I remember she had a striped sweater, and like in ceramics, in sculpture, you can just make that stripe go around. Like in painting, you have to figure out how it folds perspectively, but in sculpture, you can just go around like that. That was like a really exciting moment. This is just an installation to get a sense of the size of some of these paintings. The painting that has actually my husband and his friend, a few paintings of men. Men, it's very strange for me to paint men just because I really don't know that much about them, or as much as I know about women. This is graduation, I think it's called Graduation Day. And the architecture is this composite of this weird contemporary buildings in Moscow and some of the buildings in St. Petersburg. But graduation in Russia is a very important event. You graduate from high school. When I was growing up, you were only allowed to have 1 degree. You couldn't just go to liberal arts college and take piano, chemistry, and Hebrew, which is what I did my freshman year. You had to decide that at 16 you were going to be a doctor, or you were going to be, a philosopher, and then you could never have another chance. So it was really like an entry into an adulthood, and so graduation from high school is a huge event, and you just see these people, celebrating. This is a bad close-up. This is a closer color, kind of celebrating the goodbye to childhood. And then the space in the paintings has changed a little bit. I was starting to think, like, where is it? Is it in the nature? Is it in the city? And I was interested in this space that was neither the city nor the wild nature, this kind of outskirts that are not tended to, that are not really admired for their beauty, but are more, and the women became kind of like not quite central, but I think because of that idea of being on the crossroads, not no longer being a child, but having all these different options and not quite knowing which one to take. So more literally, it would be the city or the country, but it could also be taken in different ways than that. This is a small painting. And then in the summers, I was able to kind of leave New York and just paint landscape, which to me is always amazing. You're in the landscape, your paint handling becomes freer, you are becoming more specific about light. So I would make these little studies, and then I would insert the figures into the landscape. This is another small painting that actually has men in it. I have a young son, so I feel like I'm gonna learn a lot of things. That might become a subject matter at a certain point. One of the things that I was doing when he was born is I was walking around with him, like for all his naps, which was about 7 hours a day. And as I was walking, I was just trying to observe the light in the park on the water. So, and then when I was finally in the studio, I would kind of recreate that from the memory. And then the groups of work started going more into the kind of wilderness of the country. They became a little bit more, I guess, unhinged, almost kind of ritualistic. I eventually started getting bored with that kind of space, well, all the figures are small, this kind of, and I was thinking, like, what can I do? I tried to put some larger figures. That space didn't quite work. And then I started thinking about still life. So, you can put a still life in front of the figures, and you can create that sense of depth of space. But still life is a kind of, speaking a little bit with Kathy at dinner, it's kind of like a loaded subject matter, because no matter what you paint, it's going to have certain kind of meaning. If you paint a knife, or if you paint a book, but what kind of book? There's always like a meaning that's attached to those objects. So I decided to go with like the dumbest, like not the dumbest, but like the most straightforward, painting 101. You paint pears or apples, fruit. I went to a supermarket and I decided to get the cheapest things. I got this cake. I mean, I left the studio. The cake was intact for like 2 years. It looked exactly like this. And then putting that kind of mixing the genre of the still life with the genre of the landscape and the genre of the figurative painting, to me, that started having a narrative of its own. At the end, somebody said, "Oh, is that a portrait? Like my son was born. Is that a portrait of you and your husband and your son? Like those two wilted plants?" And I was not thinking about that at the time, but I think actually it was. Right. This is a kind of a smaller painting. This was painted during Hurricane Sandy, just not during, like it wasn't a one-day painting, but I think that's what I was thinking. And this is a small detail. The painting is called The Pilot. And this is like an attempt for a larger figure that didn't quite work out. That painting is already painted over. And then I kind of stumbled across flowers. One of the things also when you have a young child is that your time becomes very, very structured. It's basically structured by daycare. So you kind of like, you have this much time in the studio. I had to make sure that every time I painted, it was really exciting for me. I could not have the doubts. Like I feel like lately I'm just so happy to get to the studio. This whole doubt of what am I doing doesn't exist. I had to figure it out in such a way that I was, I don't think that's necessarily great, but that's what I need to do. And so I thought, if I have flowers, they're so beautiful, and they have this kind of choice of color that I have to react to, and they also live a very short time. I have to like work very, very fast. So I started bringing flowers in the painting and kind of setting the figures against the motif of the flowers. So it's just a detail. And to me, that was like another kind of exciting thing, almost like painting stripes around that little porcelain figure. So the foreground became the flowers, and then the figures became kind of in the background to detail. And another detail. And this is, I guess, the most recent exhibition that I had. My studio right now in Gowanus, they have Whole Foods. So basically, I feel like my whole repertoire is dictated by the Whole Foods flower supplier. But these are, and they're not very good, I have to tell you. They're not a great flower supplier. But that's this kind of strange arrangements. You know, I was reading books about flowers and flowers, you know, Dutch flowers. One of my favorite artists is Jane Freilacher, who kind of explored that motif of the foreground being still life, and a lot of them are flowers, and the background is the landscape as seen through the flowers. And they also kind of dictated the color choices. You know, I can't say that, you know, I was kind of getting away from that orangish red, you know, and into the territory of green, you know, things that were not necessarily comfortable. Or violet, like that was really hard for me to make a painting that had violet in it as well. This is a painting that's, and then the way that they would get composed, it would be in this, like I'll bring my little still landscape studies from the summers when I go into the country and paint, you know. And then sometimes I would put a book with a reproduction of another painting, like this was a ship from a painting by George Bellows. You know, so that kind of an exposure of seams, you know, it's not really, like if you put flowers in the landscape, it's not going to look like that. But I love the fact that I could paint from observing all these different sources and yet create something that was also very kind of artificial, you know, like a way of film in the result would be pretty artificial. This is a small group, like 16 by 16 inches. And I think I'm kind of coming towards the end. 40 by 50. And there is also kind of this element of time that's interesting for me, because as I'm working, and the paintings take a long time. For me, I feel like it's a long time, you know, maybe like, you know, I work at 3 or 4 at the time, so it will take me, you know, about 2 years to complete a group of 8 paintings. And so the flowers die, you know, they wilt, and I kind of like revise the painting, you know, I change them. So there's a certain kind of time quality that the flowers bring to me as well. And I think this is the last image that I have. It's yeah, it's a Thank you.
To take some questions.
Definitely, yeah. People have questions.
So these paintings that you're doing now, are you still starting the same way with kind of color blocking and then working the flowers into that, or how are you starting?
Well, actually, the paintings that I'm working on right now, including this one, I'm painting over some old paintings. So they already have like another color structure. You know, it changes dramatically, but they would, you know, like I would turn them upside down. You know, I don't think there's any that you can, I don't know, there's no, like some of them you can actually see the figures like upside down from other figures, but I like working from something that's a little bit unplanned, and I just happen to have all these canvases of things that, you know, I've had from the past, you know, 10 years that kind of horrified me a little bit, like the fact that I thought that was a finished painting at the time. So that gives me some tension, you know. And then I just kind of like, it has to be simultaneously worked as like flowers, figures, landscape, flowers, figures, you know. So they changed a lot. There's a lot of, you can't see it from the reproduction, but there's like a lot of scraping, you know, a lot of a revision. And actually the surface of them is kind of rough, you know, you almost see the contours of older things underneath them.
It seems like if these are chronological, the last few slides you showed, the figures are becoming, for lack of a better word, like thumbelinas.
Mm-hmm.
They're small people moving through a giant, like the landscape and the figures, or the flowers and the figures are becoming integrated.
All right.
Whereas before that, it was like a superimposition.
Mm-hmm.
It's like you started one painting and then superimposed another on top. And then sometimes there was interplay, and going back to that Cezanne painting you showed, it's like experimental.
Mm-hmm.
Is that, am I on to something there? Or is that...
No, I think you're absolutely correct. Yeah. I mean, the whole, like, you know, I try to think of them as like the figures are in the distance, you know, but there is, you know, there is the incoherency of space, you know, that's definitely there. But for me, I stop when they resonate as something that makes sense, you know, like if, you know, if they don't work spatially, I keep, you know, but when I think that they're spatially resolved, that space might not be the logical space of if you actually had the figures in the distance, you know. But I think the difference between like an earlier group and the group now, I think you're absolutely right in your observation, for sure.
You started talking about cinema, and forced perspective is a trick to just talk in cinema, and just putting something here and then putting something back here to change the scale perspective.
Right.
Smaller.
Yeah. Like there's an Antonioni film, I forgot, La Ventura, you know, where there's like this people looking for a missing person on the island, and there'll be like very large figure right next to somebody who is really small, you know. But because we understand that this is a real space, we think of that as a distance. But if we didn't understand that, it would look very strange.
I like the way the teenage girls in the background are going through they're totally absorbed in their dramas. It's like they're excluding each other or they're helping each other. And while these huge flowers are overpowering them, they don't even see them. But I wondered what you said. You read a lot of teenage novels and you see young adult movies. I wonder which one.
Oh, God. The ones that everybody's thinking about, those ones. No, I do. Oh, God, I never watched television. And then one year, like when I was 36, which was like, you know how like there's a young adult television that's like for people from 18 to 36? Like that was my last year. I watched the OC. Have you seen that? Oh my God! It was like I was like waking up Craig at 3 o'clock, and I was like a.m. I was like, oh, Misha Barton's dead, you know. I don't know. I love the artificiality, right? The stage is always school, you know. Like there's no. I mean, I can talk about this, but the people are for. You know, it's not like college where people like apply, you know. They all get accepted based on certain kind of GPA. This is like school, so it's like very random the way that they're all forced into one environment, and they always have to go. Like every day they have to go, you know. So the drama against this kind of like structure, I feel like it cannot exist in any other kind of genre, you know, because you always have to go to school, and if you don't go, then that you become a particular person who is not going to school, but nothing else. You know, workplace, or I don't know what other genres there are, but it cannot exist anywhere else. And the young adult, they're usually like there's one writer who wrote right before the revolution, like in early 1900. You know, this kind of like school. It's always like school, you know. And then, of course, there's like Twilight, which is very good. The first book, yeah. I mean, I read very serious things as well, you know, but that's like a thing that I listen to the studio on tape usually.
I'm not sure if you answered this. Do you paint your figures within the context, or do you ever insert them as if they were wandering off the set?
Oh, that's so great. I never thought about that. I always think of them in the context, but I never thought about like breaking that context, you know, yeah, I never thought about that, but I think that's such an amazing idea. Yeah. Yeah, because I always feel like they're so like involved in their own reality and never breaking that.
Am I allowed to ask if you're a Tarkovsky fan?
Yes, it's so funny. I used to kind of hate him, you know, because I was like, oh, white horse, spilled milk, you know. And now I'm so into it, you know, definitely. The like mirror, you know, the idea of like memory. And, you know, it's funny because I think like the way that people kind of characterize they always, and I started talking like that too, like young women, teenagers, you know, but I never really, I don't think of them as like, well, that's a whole another story, you know. I don't really think of them as like children or even that particularly young. There was one period of time where I actually had a model, you know, a student that I was very, like had a very good rapport with, you know. So she modeled for a whole series of paintings. She was kind of like a stand-in for me, you know, but I don't, yeah. I mean, I'm painting kind of myself, you know, I'm not a teenager, so I don't know if they're like young necessarily.
I think he was constrained by the medium because he shot everything 7mm, I think, so everything's like this.
Mm-hmm.
So all of his shots, he has those big wide shots that are just that. Like in Sacrament, there's a house on fire.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah,
Shot.
right. And then there's also like the model of the house. That's not a real house that's on fire. It's a model of the small maquette of the house. Yeah. No, he's amazing. Yeah.
When you decided to bring the fruits into your paintings, or like one in particular, that was interesting. Like, and maybe you thought about this. You said you chose like easy ones, like a pear and an apple.
Mm-hmm.
But I was wondering if you also like brought those particular fruits in as like relating to the body, and how those particular fruits, like society makes references to the feminine body, like as variations of the pear, or apple bottom jeans.
Oh, yeah. No, I did not think about that. I think if I did think of that, I probably wouldn't use the pear. I think I'm kind of like, it's a little bit perverse in the sense that I try to, like I was in graduate school during the time where there were, you know, 90s, right? So Lisa Yuskevich, John Curran, you know, they were like kind of starting to be on the scene, especially in New York, but I was not in New York. And this was before you can Google the images, you know? Like one time a visiting artist gave me their names, and then I had to like put a request in the inner library loan, and I got a little brochure. Like they didn't have like what they have now, you know? So it was really like I was at Brandeis, and the idea was I'm going to paint the figure until I grow up and become a little smarter, and then I'm going to move on to being an abstract artist, you know? And it switches, you know? Now it's like everybody has to, you know, it's like, you know, there's like fashion, you know, trends. And it felt like really wrong, you know? So I think it's a little bit, it's a little perverse to like, you paint young girls and then you paint like flowers on top of that. You know, like those are like kind of like cheesy kind of things, you know? So fruit also felt that way, you know, it's like you cannot have a serious painting with those things, you know? But of course there's amazing, you know, there's like Fontaine Latour, you know, there's all this very amazing artists who paint flowers or who paint young women, you know? So, the fruit, I was just thinking like, oh, that's the most like expected still life, you know. I did not think about apple bottom jeans, no.
Are you
Have you experimented with sculpture or ceramics since that, or do you want to at all?
I would love to, love to. Yeah, I mean, it depends, like, on this, like, having a studio, all of that, but yeah, absolutely. I haven't had a chance, but I would love to.
Yeah, I'm just imagining like really expansive.
Yeah.
single figure.
Oh, I would love to. Oh, it would be amazing, amazing. Yeah, but it's,
Think about per person or guild or something. I can sense in the flowers and then in the figures, which are becoming more and more voluptuous. A lot of pleasure. Like when I see the painting, I feel pleasure because I feel almost how you painted the flowers and felt pleasure by painting it. How you feel with the process of the figures changing from the beginning, like they were almost for a smacky movie, very still, now they're much more open and the flowers are just like pure pleasure.
yeah, I think you're right. I love painting flowers, like love. But the paintings, most of the time, it's like painting flowers, and then I'm like, that does not work on its own. It's almost like it always has, and the figures are always difficult to me. Like once I get it, it's fine. But picking a gesture, finding the space between them. There's usually a lot. Like this one changed a lot. There was like maybe more figures here. Actually, like in a real painting, you can still, like there was a figure right here, but there were, you can still the ridge, paint it over. So those switch a lot. They kind of have to be locked in a particular gesture with a particular space, distance between them, so it feels to me, kind of charged, and that, the clothes, all of that. But flowers, it's an indulgence, and I feel terribly guilty. Like I email my friend, I'm like, I'm still painting the flowers. I don't know how I'm gonna get out of it, And they're like, oh, just paint until you can't paint it, Hopefully I will get out of it, but for now I'm still kind of into it.
This guilt which shows through almost makes the painting even more exciting.
Thank you. Thank you.
I am super interested in how persistent you are since even undergraduate work until all the way to this point of just consistency, I guess. I wonder, especially when you're speaking of the guilt, doubt, and resistance of the contemporary art trend and such, have you ever branched off, like even just have a parallel project that has completely different kind of principles or
No. I haven't. No. I feel like the work, and I think a lot about it, To me, the work changes, but very slowly, like like on a very, very slow level, So it's I have to kind of really paint something that I'm very interested in, So until when it stops being interesting, then I start like throwing something else in. And it's weird because in terms of contemporary art, there's like trends. Like I've already like been around for long enough for there to be a trend where like first there was no figurative painting, that was considered amateur. Then all of a sudden everywhere you spit was like figurative painting. Then all of a sudden it was like all abstract. Now it's like coming back, figuration and stuff. It's cycles, so I think the primary kind of principle for me is to paint something that is very exciting for me to go into the studio for, because I feel like it's like, but yeah. I mean, things like color, like I used to only use earth colors, then I would like, switch the palette and use the colors that would be very uncomfortable for me. So the work changes that way. But in terms of iconography, I haven't really found a reason to switch into something completely different outside of this kind of artificial idea of just doing it for the sake of being different. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Vera.
Thank you so much. Yeah.